Welcome everybody to this special live stream. We're doing this a little bit differently this time. We have a special guest, Project Combat. Wait, what do we want you to call you? Sometimes in Discord you call yourself Marty, otherwise it's Jana. Do you have like 3 different names? You know, there's a YouTube channel on that called Project Combat that would call that unintuitive. So
I guess I never gave myself an identity, especially because the whole
Yeah.
point of the series wasn't to like content create in the context of like I'm a personality.
right. Yeah.
So I never decided. I kind of wanted it to be anonymous because it just gives it that like air of what's going on, right? Like,
right. It's more about the
who the hell is this
ideas
guy?
than the person. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure.
So the Twitch name is just a leftover from a previous identity that I had, and then Discord is just that's my name. So
Gotcha. Well, what do you
I don't know.
what do you want us to refer to you as?
What sounds more fun to you? The Project Combat guy, just my
The
actual
Project
name.
Combat guy, Marty. Is that your name?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go with that. Anyways, so what really intrigued me with your series is that, like, again, for those of you who might be watching on your channel, this is the combat section. There'll be, if you're watching this on YouTube, later on we'll be talking about kind of more general discussion and issues with RS3 and that'll be on my channel. But for those of you who might not know me, I started playing RS3 a couple months ago as a traditionally old school player. And as I started to get deeper into my Iron Man account, like I started to notice some issues with the game that I felt anyways, right? And I felt like the sentiment from YouTube comments or Twitch or whatever in general was kind of like, oh, okay, you just haven't gotten used to it. You don't know how this works, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? But what I really resonated with your videos as a newer player was how you were talking about how the combat system needs to be more intuitive, right? That was the big thing that really hit home with me, because there was a lot of things that I felt like, oh, this isn't intuitive, right? But if I say that, then most people in the comments were just like, oh, no, you just don't know what you're talking about, right? You're a new player. You know what I mean? And it's really easy. It's really easy to say like, oh, okay, I've spent 10,000 hours in this flawed system. Like I know how it works perfectly, right? That goes for anything, right? It's really easy to say that. But at the end of the day, if you want, for the longevity of the game, you need to be able to retain new players. And I think it's important to kind of look at these things, and yeah, I 100% agree that there's a lot of things in the game that just feel really unintuitive. The biggest example I'd say that came for me was when I first started doing Hellweir on my Iron Man. I was trying to use I was trying to use the vulnerability spell, right? I was trying to vuln Hellweir, right? And everyone was saying like, okay, it's slow with your staff, right? You have to like time it properly, right? And I was like, okay. So I would watch my auto attack go out, and then I'd cast some abilities, right? And I'm thinking to myself like, okay, I haven't had an auto attack in like 5 seconds. I should be able to vuln now, right?
Yeah.
But I would just be spamming the button, and then still it was just like, 3-4 seconds or something before I could vuln. And then I figured out eventually that it's like, okay, if you use a defensive ability, it like resets the cooldown, and then you can throw out an auto attack or a curse or something. I'm like, how does this make any sense? You know what I mean? Like how this attack speed on my weapon is supposed to be the auto attack speed, right? Like I haven't auto attacked for however long. You know what I mean? And again, like I don't think there's any issue with that system itself, but as long as it's like, whatever it is, it should make sense or be like kind of explained clearly and intuitively. You know what I mean? So that's what I really found. It was just like, there's a lot of little things like that in the game that just make it feel clunky to a new player. And then you have to kind of learn these nuances that aren't explained. Like without any kind of outside resources, how are you ever supposed to learn that? You know what I mean? Like how are you ever supposed to learn that? Okay, you're supposed to anticipate and then vuln. Or like with Hellweir, it's like, okay, you freedom to clear the bleed and then vuln. You know what I mean? Something like that. It feels really weird and clunky for a new player, from a new player's perspective,
Was it explained to you why that works?
What?
Was it explained to you why anticipation lets you fire off vulnerability?
No. They said that it sort of like resets the auto attack cooldown or something like that. No.
No.
Okay.
What's actually happening is every time you cast a magic ability, you're resetting your auto attack cooldown based on your weapon that's equipped.
Okay.
If you use a defensive ability, it doesn't interact with your auto attack cooldown, so your auto attack cooldown keeps ticking. That's why you're able to get an auto attack off.
So it's like if my auto attack is, say, 6 ticks for example. The global cooldown's 3 ticks, right? So if I cast an ability, excuse me. So if I cast an ability, then I need to wait 2 global cooldowns basically before, because it basically counts as an auto attack almost, right?
It just resets the auto timer, and there's even further wonkiness to it that I don't know about. Like, someone was like, it's not quite like that. With ranged, it works slightly differently. I'm like, I don't
Right.
I don't care.
The point is, but again, the point is that it should be more intuitive, and it like, or at least have a way that you should. Again, you should be able to learn about all the mechanics within the game without external resources. You know what I mean? I think that's a really good point that you bring up in your videos too. Is that like sure, okay, there's min-maxing to the highest degree that people might make YouTube videos about in a game like League of Legends or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, the base mechanics of the game should be understandable or learnable, within the game,
Yeah, that's super standard too. And that's, I don't know if you watched the interview that they had with the Combat Council, but they were kind of
I watched your reaction of it, yeah.
Yeah, they were defending the idea of games don't teach everything to their community. Like what's the counterexample? I don't see games that teach players. And that's where the frustration came from, because
it's like every game does that.
Every game does it, but they do it. I think they interpreted the question in a way of, why aren't you teaching us the hyper complexities of the game, rather than why do I have to go look up a guide on how area of effect works? Like it's those simple baseline things that should be intuitive and are intuitive in literally every other game that aren't. And it's like, from the beginning, EOC didn't deliver on this. 10 years later, it still doesn't. But we haven't. It hasn't. No one's been able to stand up and say, this is exactly why this system didn't do what it was supposed to do, and it still sucks 10 years later.
Right.
Rather than people saying, it's gotten much better and it sucked on release, but it's good now. I honestly think that it's just like the survivorship of people that still play the game that say that.
Sure, the sunken cost fallacy in a way.
They all left, right? They all moved on, or they moved on to old school, or now they're playing other games.
Right. And then that was a really big drop off too.
It's a huge one. And you can tell it was because from EOC release up until I think when they launched Legacy, they were in full damage control mode, and they kept on tweaking what the system did, but they did it in a very rushed way, rather than relying on the foundations that set the combat system design from when they were internally working on it. So now you have this like mishmash of random scripting that doesn't necessarily make sense, like auto attacks, because initially with EOC, auto attacks always fired. There was no cooldown. They just went off in the background while you were using abilities.
Sure.
And they changed that as a result of feedback, but the script, the base foundation of the game, intended for auto attacks to be used in this specific way. So they didn't prepare for the way people ended up using the system.
Sure.
And it breaks. And now it's just
I think
emergent gameplay.
Yeah, I think EOC overall was kind of rushed, and I have no problem with the. I saw that video that you were talking where you were reacting to that, right? And I have no problem with the idea of, what did they call it, emergent gameplay, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I have no problem with the idea of that, but again, I think part of the issue too was how the RS guy kind of framed the question in that in that context. Not that it's his responsibility, right? But again, I think that maybe among the high level community, like you said, I think that they think the issue is, okay, we need to teach this combat system to new players. We need a better way of teaching that, right? But again, I think that if the combat system overall just felt more intuitive and it just worked better, then it wouldn't be as big of an issue. You know what I mean? Like, again, you talk about in your videos about giving players feedback, right? Not through text or something, but through audio and visuals that make you, give you an intuitive way of making you feel like you're doing the right thing, And I think back to like other competitive games or more action focused games like MOBAs or whatever, right? Where it's like, the sound effects and everything, like if you hit a right knock up into a combo with your teammate or whatever, it feels really satisfying, and it's like, oh, okay, I did the right thing, no matter what the damage numbers are, right? Because obviously in those games too, the damage numbers can scale, right? But yeah, no matter what the damage numbers are, there's feedback there that kind of teaches you what to do. And again, I think another good point you make is it's not about necessarily making the game easier, right? Like there could still be complexities and depth to it. That's another thing I want to discuss later. But from a base level perspective, like basic mechanics in the game should make more sense. Like things like detonate, right? You talk about AoEs a lot. Like detonate feels wonky as hell to me. Like I'm like sometimes it feels like it explodes around my body. Sometimes it feels like it explodes around my target. You know, it just feels really inconsistent. So yeah, I think again, if we were able to design the system in a more intuitive way that gave the players feedback, or I guess just that it's important that abilities kind of do what you would think they would do based on their description and their name and things like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, it feels like EOC tried to do things the system didn't support. Like the idea of detonate, it sounds like a key down ability, something you should press and
Yeah.
hold and then let go to explode. But it doesn't do that. And is that because the system doesn't support it? And if it doesn't support it, why introduce an ability like that if your game can't let you execute on just like very simple input? I've never played a game where I charge a bomb and then let go and I have to press the key twice. Like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I always thought that was super wonky too. Like the first, this actually goes back like pre this, like I used to play RS3 in like 2016, right? A little bit. And now, so like back in that period, that was when I was first trying to figure out dead. I mean, to be fair, that was before like blast diffusion boots and stuff, so people didn't really use it very much. But like actually trying to use that ability, like say if there's a grouped up mobs in Slayer or something, like I just gave up so many times because I was like,
yeah,
I just like hit it, and then either I'd accidentally like let it go like at 0%, you know what I mean, or it just felt super weird, you know.
and it's a missed opportunity because what if you're someone who's just starting the game and you have
Yeah.
these frustrating experiences with combat with an ability that's supposed to feel like a powerful moment? You don't get that payoff,
Oh, I
and
wanted
when
to
you're
hide this.
deciding what game to log into later on, you're not going to think, oh, I had a really cool experience in RuneScape. You're going to think, I'm going to go play some other game because I pressed button and thing happened and it made me happy. Like,
Right.
people will chase the dopamine, and it's not providing, or EOC isn't providing that right now.
Yeah. Stealthy Sumo here left a comment basically just kind of, well, memeingly explaining how detonate works. But that, again, that's not the point, right? Is like it should feel intuitive. You know what I mean? It's almost like when some games, like you enter a game and spacebar isn't the jump key. You know what I mean?
Or like the dash key in an isometric
Right.
game. Like,
Right.
simple things like that.
It's like there's certain things that maybe it's part of like kind of the inherent like gaming language or whatever, but there's certain things that just like should feel a certain way. You know what I mean? And should react a certain way. Or like tsunami is another example that it's like, okay, you have this massive wave, and actually based on like your video from today, I would say tsunami is one of the better feeling abilities personally. You know what I mean? Like I remember when EOC came out.
Very low bar.
That's a very low bar. It is, right? But again, like I remember when EOC came out originally, like in the beta, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, right? You like ride up on this. But again, when you're comparing it to other standards, like I think you gave an example from, what was that game? Lost Ark, I think.
Lost Ark, yeah.
Right?
The water wave makes
Right.
so much
It was
more
like
sense.
it was like way cooler. You know what I mean?
And that's not even an ultimate. That's just a basic like random ability. Like it's not,
Yeah.
you know. So an ultimate in RuneScape doesn't even compare to just like a standard ability in another game.
Yeah. That's the other
Wave
thing.
should push things back. Like
that's the other thing that's I kind of felt off to me. It was like ultimates, because ultimates don't really feel like ultimates. But that's not something that I learned until I started playing MOBAs and Overwatch and stuff like that. And like, again, like 2017-ish, you know what I mean? When I started really getting into Overwatch and stuff, it's like, oh my God, ultimates are powerful. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's like
That's
this
what
is
they're supposed to do?
game changing.
Oh my
right?
God.
And it's
Yeah.
it's a high cost, high reward type situation where it's like, okay, you've built this up over the last 2 minutes or something, right? But it's like, you know, if you earth shatter the whole entire team, if you hit that at the right moment, right, you just win the fight. You know what I mean? Exactly. And I think that's it, like you talked about in your video today. It's like, if with, you know, planted feet and all these other things, Sunshine has like a 65% uptime or something like that, you said, right?
Yeah.
And
something ridiculous.
And actually, that's another interesting take, is that I know in a lot of other games, ultimates like cooldown doesn't start until the ability's over, right? You know what I mean? Like,
that kind of depends on the design you're going for.
Sure.
Because you could do that, or you could just set the cooldown to be an added 38 seconds if it lasts 38 seconds,
Sure.
right? Like,
I guess with
that
Sunshine, it wouldn't really work too well, I don't think, just because you can't cancel it. Like, I'm thinking more about like channeled ultimates and stuff from like Smite, right? Where it might be like a 10, 20 second ultimate, and then the cooldown would start after that. But that's kind of a small thing. What I'd like to ask you about is this a concept of when it comes to difficulty. I think this was your Switchscape video you were talking about this.
Yep. Yeah.
You talked about the idea of massive complexity versus depth, and I think that's the league player in you talking, right?
It is.
But I really like that. I like the idea of having like meaningful decisions to be made. And I agree with your stance on kind of Switchscape of that. A lot of times it's just kind of unnecessary complexity. Like, it's like, okay, if I want to Sunshine with planted feet, I just have to press like 4 keybinds like right now. That just kind of feels unnecessary. And it doesn't, like you said, it increases the APM. But is that the kind of difficulty that you want to see in the game? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, I thought your example with old school and how switches feel a lot more meaningful in old school, I agree with that as well. Like, if I don't know how deep you got into old school, but if you're doing like Theater of Blood or something,
I've done Inferno, so I've
okay, so you're relative,
yeah,
you're pretty deep in there then, right? Actually, I'll get to the Inferno in a bit, but like with Switchscape and stuff in old school, it feels a lot better because it's like you have a primary weapon, but you're switching to another weapon for a reason. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's it's not just on autopilot, right? It's like, and a lot of times it can be a calculated reason. Like, say you're doing Nilo. I don't know if you've done TOB, but if you're doing Nilo boss, right? And it's like, okay, you hit it with a whip, and it's like you might swap to your C Halley to get that big hit off because, right before it swaps or whatever, because you only have a limited time, or there's a certain special attack you want, right? And it does feel a lot more meaningful. But speaking of the Inferno, right? Actually, would you go ahead first and define what you mean by depth, I guess, before we get deeper into that? Like, what do you mean by depth as far as like a meaning of difficulty? You know what I mean? Would you summarize your like thoughts on how you would like to see the difficulty curve with the game?
Yeah, not everyone's going to agree with my definition. If I go off the standard game design definition, complexity is describing how hard it is to kind of figure something out, and depth describes how hard it is to land on the optimal solution based on the information you have, right? And Inferno is actually a good example of depth only because when you start a wave, it's random. You have a few seconds to assess what the wave looks like, and then the depth is the optimizations and how you prepare the wave, because you have so many options, right? You can go behind one of 3 different pillars, and there's 4 places you can stand on each pillar. So that's the depth with Inferno every single wave.
That's actually what I was going to say. Yeah, it's like, I think that the Inferno is probably the best example of depth in RuneScape, because every single wave is different, and because of that, like, your wave 63 might be different than my wave 63, and based on that, we could be making completely different decisions, right? Yeah. You might run to South Pillar, I might be running, to whatever. Like, every time I've done the Inferno, it's always like, it feels like my decisions matter, because if you make the wrong decision, you die, right? Where it feels like a lot of times in high-level PVM and RS3, it's like, okay, you miss your Q key and you die. You know what I mean? Where I kind of like that more decision-making gameplay, but that's also, like, I guess in competitive games traditionally, I've always been more of like, I've found more interest in like the strategy rather than just like clicking on heads or whatever. But yeah.
You need depth for interesting PvP, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it makes for interesting PVM only because it Zuck is a good example of zero depth.
Right.
The Zuck fight has no depth. When I did Zuck the first time, the very first time I did Zuck, I immediately died because I misstepped.
Right.
The second time I did Zuck, before I actually did the fight, I logged out and just watched people. Like, I just watched clearing Zuck, not even guide videos, just watched people do the fight.
Yeah.
For an hour straight. I logged in and copied them 1-to-1 and got it on my first try. Because all I had to do was literally memorize what they did and just repeat it.
Right.
I didn't have to make any decisions. Whereas working up to Zuck was more about figuring out how to solve a wave.
Right. And you have a split second to do that. Right.
Exactly.
You have a split second to figure out, okay, do I step around the corner here? The Inferno is by far the most fun I've ever had in combat and in any version of the RuneScape. Besides Zuck, like I never enjoyed Zuck either, actually. but yeah, I would say for me personally, the Inferno is the most fun that I've had, just because again of that decision making, and it's like you can look at any Inferno. Like I guess once I completed the Inferno, I started kind of like coaching clanmates and stuff through it when I was doing that. And so many times I see they die, right? And they'd be like, "Oh, I don't know what happened." And then I'd watch it back. I'd be like, "Well, actually, if you stepped here, right, and then prayed this,
I made a poor decision."
Right? Yeah, 99% of the time, it's well, actually 100% of the time, it's a poor decision, right? Or something along those lines. You know what I mean? Or they, it's not as much mechanical as it is decision making. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the skill expression comes from how optimal of a decision you make in the moment, and it's not even like right or wrong. It's this like range of that was a decent wave, that was a perfect wave, that was
Right.
a
I think optimal is a
wave.
great word for that, right? Like you can make the worst decision. You know, you can make the optimal decision would be perfect, but you can still make a good decision and make it through the wave. You know what I mean? It might not be optimal, but based on from a speedrunner's perspective or whatever. But how would you like to see that implemented in RS3 with bosses and whatnot in RS3?
They have so many more combat tools available to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like what defines old school combat and old school bossing? It's almost all focused on positioning and then extra mechanics on top of that are boss specific. But
Mm-hmm.
like 95% of old school is really just character control and positioning, and you don't
Yeah.
have like a mobility system to support, so it's really just clicking and then recognizing when it's safe to DPS.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other components are prayer switching occasionally,
Yeah, it's a lot of it's
and gear.
timing, I would say. If you wanted to put a blanket word over all of it, I'd say it's timing, you know?
Whereas RuneScape has this like set of abilities that they can lean into, where old school can only make use of special attacks every now and then, so it's not something that they can lean on all the time. Um, I want to see EOC bosses actually leverage that tool in a way where I have to decide between what tools I have available and what fits the job in the moment, rather than kind of pre-planning my attack and then just going through the script, which is what happens right now. But
Yeah.
even something simple as the Raksha example I gave, all they had to do was randomize which special attack he does, and
It's way more
make the
interactive.
it's just more interesting for the player to kind of react to what might happen. Um, but then you make the mechanic more reasonable to react to, and then you can make it more challenging because it doesn't feel like BS if you like get hit by it. Whereas right now the tail swipe, they have to make the reaction time window like a single tick because you can predict it and you can anticipate it.
Yeah, because
And then
it's the same cycle every time, you know?
yeah, and
Yeah.
then they make it super punishing. If you get hit by the tail swipe, you're stunned for God knows how long. You take a shit ton of damage. Your prayer gets knocked down. Like all these things to punish you for not remembering and anticipating that tail swipe. Um, but I also think that the set of tools players have access to isn't that interesting. So it's the bosses that they can design are very clearly restricted by that set of tools, and I think Zamorak is a great example of that, because if you look at all of Zamorak's mechanics, they had to do um, they had to give him like defense piercing effects because player defensive tools are so goddamn powerful that you can
Sure.
just cheese absolutely everything. And how do they do that? Well, they cheese you back. And then the boss just devolves into a DPS test, because ultimately that game is just about pumping out DPS, and abusing the many, many defensive tools you have access to. But even the Zamorak fight is mostly scripted. It like there's randomness in the last mechanic where you have to kind of look at the rune order, but that's not really the kind of randomness that involves decision making.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like reacting to a red light with a red button press and a blue light with a blue button press, rather than going, does it make more sense to do red or blue in this situation if this light is this color?
Right.
I don't know if that actually answered the question I had, but
Yeah, I think in a roundabout way. No, I agree. You know, I was kind of thinking back to the last time I played RS3 and like trying to figure out like what turned me off of it, you know? And I think that when it came to the late game, it just felt like a lot of people kind of like meme on me in my comments about like old school PVM. They're like, oh, you know, you're just farming the same brain dead bosses over and over again, right? But then it's like I was kind of looking at RS3. It's kind of the same thing. Like I've figured out that yeah. Maybe I'm being a little too kind,
the
but
exact same thing.
but it's like it's fun to learn a boss in RS3. I would say for in some ways, some of them at least have been fun for me to learn. But then after that, it's just like, okay, then it's just your same choreographed, pre-planned thing, however many times until you get the drop, which I don't think is that interesting. And a lot of times it's that way in old school. But again, I think the exception was the Inferno, and I think that's why I enjoyed it so much. But even something like the Theater of Blood is still quite scripted in that way as well. It's just hard, I guess. But
yeah, how hard do you make the script to learn, and that defines a boss's difficulty. And then they, like a boss like Virago, when it was released, it just had a really complicated script because it had 5 phases, a bunch of different random mechanics you had to memorize. But that's not like out of character for an MMORPG, and I don't think that that's inherently problematic either. A lot of raiding is about learning the complexities of a boss, and a lot of raiding is about wiping until you figure out all the mechanics. But because of the way both RuneScapes reward you for bossing, which is how many kills can you get per hour with endless limits, it feels really bad to fail a kill, because every failed kill is hitting into your kills per hour, or every inefficient kill is damaging how much money you're making, and so you're less inclined to bring learners because there's literally no benefit to it other than you being nice. Whereas in something like Lost Ark, if I'm doing a Legion raid, which is like an endgame raid, you can clear it once a week. So I don't care if it takes me an extra 3 hours to clear it with some newer people, because if I wipe, all I'm really losing is like an hour or two, and I was probably not going to do anything for that hour anyways. Whereas RuneScape, I'm like, I have a goal, I want to make 100 mil an hour, I'm going to keep killing the boss over and over and over again. And that also contributes to making the boss frustrating to learn, being annoying, because you just want to get to the point where you can farm it. Whereas if I clear a Legion raid, I'm like, woo, I'll see you next week, kind of thing.
Sure. But do you think time lock mechanics like that is the way to go? Because that's something I want to talk about in like kind of the second half of this is like time lock mechanics feel frustrating as hell to me. And there's so many of them in RS, it feels like. You know what I mean?
Yeah. To be a good game designer, you have to also consider your community. And RuneScape's kind of established as this game where people can farm something endlessly. So it's a hard one to solve, because I don't think the solution is just let's give things time locks. But I do think there's value and potential in ideas that they've implemented through Elder God Wars. So if you kill a boss in Elder God Wars, every 6 minutes you get this like chest that gives you money. So it doesn't matter how fast you kill your boss. Yeah, there's a cap to how many you can get per hour. And I think something along those lines, where it's like bonus rewards every week or something. So you can farm it if you want, but if you challenge a boss maybe once a week or something, you get like that extra reward, to not make it feel like you necessarily have to farm it and that's the only way to approach it. But I also heard that they were planning something like that with Zamorak and then didn't go through with it. So I don't know if it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But I see a chat comment where someone's saying GP plays such a big role in both RuneScapes, and that's a big reason why bossing
works the way it does.
Yeah, and it heavily emphasizes GP per hour. I'm a big fan of things like Vorkath, where at 50 kills you're guaranteed this upgrade that's untradeable and shows you completed content, etc.
Yeah.
That's fun to me, and I'm disappointed that Chambers of Xeric and Theater of Blood didn't offer some sort of untradeable reward. Like I wish that prayers from Chambers of Xeric were an untradeable.
You don't like the blood
reward.
Scythe or whatever? Or no, those are even RNG, aren't they? I actually haven't touched hard mode Tob, but
untradeable cosmetics is fine. Like rewarding people with cosmetics for doing super.
Yeah, it's fine, but it's not the point, right? Like you said, like a Vorkath or like a Fire Cape or something like that. That it's like, or even like the Zuck capes, I guess. You know what I mean?
Yeah, imagine if the Avernic Defender from Theater of Blood was guaranteed within 50 kills, and that's how you get the upgrade. Like it's an untradeable upgrade to a Defender.
Sure.
Like why is a Defender upgrade a buyable? Shouldn't it be proof that you like it breaks the theme of Defenders?
Yeah, it kind of does. Yeah.
But it also misses the opportunity to allow a player to feel progression beyond just how much money am I making per hour.
Yeah,
so sure. I'm annoyed that the Defender from Theater of Blood, even though I've made a ton of money off those drops, is a tradable reward. It should be an untradeable reward.
Yeah, I could agree with that. Yeah, especially with the thematics of it and stuff. JRS, he also said every boss in the game has a strategy that you need to follow, or every boss in every game has a strategy you need to follow. Yes. And I think that is true. like with any game, there's always going to be an optimal way to do something. I'm going to keep using that word that you gave me, optimal, right? There's an optimal way to do something in every game. But like, I think a good example is every Sunday for the last few weeks, I've been playing Monster Hunter on stream, Monster Hunter World. And that game is all about just like fighting bosses, right? That's literally from the beginning to the end, you're fighting bosses. And although like people chime in the comments, say, oh, you should try this weapon or do that, at the end of the day, there's a way to do it with everything. And it doesn't feel like I need to do it in an optimal way, as long as I can get it done. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it feels like and the bosses aren't scripted, right? Like they have a certain mechanics, like, and each boss has different mechanics, right? But they're not scripted in a certain order, right? I have to actually like be prepared for everything, right? And actually, the really cool thing about that game specifically, I don't know if you've ever played it, but the really cool thing about that game is that with these specific like monsters and dinosaurs and stuff like that, is you can almost predict what they're going to do by watching their behavior, right?
Yes.
And that is the coolest thing that I've seen. It was frustrating at first because I'm not used to it, right? But once I've learned to appreciate it, and especially I was using a great sword, which is the super slow weapon, right? And which is I think is pretty bad for beginners, right? But it was super slow, so I had to like, if I attacked at the wrong time, like I was done. You know what I mean? And I really had to watch the monster, look for the right opportunity, right, to strike. And it was a lot more decision making than mechanics. You know what I mean? Because the mechanics of it aren't that complicated. There's like, you know, maybe 3 or 4 keybinds. There's a couple combos that you need to learn for each weapon, right? But it's mostly, the game is mostly about kind of like trying to read the monsters to figure out what their next move is, right? Because they one-shot you for the most part. If you're like progressing fast enough, you know what I mean, and not upgrading fast enough, they'll like just straight up one-shot you. So I've been having a blast with it. You know what I mean? So I don't think that's really a fair point to say that like, you know, you can't have something like that in RuneScape. It's difficult though, because you said about like the precedent and the mindset. Is the precedent and the mindset is really just about grinding. You know what I mean? Whatever boss it might be. So I think a change like that might not be popular in that community. You know what I mean?
Because RuneScape has a ton of bosses, like you can have both. You can have bosses that are just scripted and memorizable, and like they're a grind fest. Go for it.
Right.
And then you can have bosses that are a little bit more in depth. I think Theater of Blood actually has a really good example of a boss with depth, and that's Pestilent Bloat, because he's kind of random. Like he does random things sometimes, and I feel like you can anticipate whether he's going to turn or not, but like
you can't though.
Guess. Yeah, you can't. But sometimes I'm like, I feel like he's going to go down soon. I feel like he's going to turn soon, but it's not tick scripted. And that makes it more fun. Even the falling hands, they're not tick scripted. It's a simple mechanic. Stay away from him and dodge the falling things. Like the boss is not complicated at all.
And
anyone watching,
you know what's funny though?
It.
You know what's really funny about that is, what is the boss that most people who are really experienced with TOB die on? Like you'll see people with 2,000 TOB KC and they die on bloat. Right?
And that's because all they've done is memorize a script, and then they disrespect the boss, and the boss wipes them.
Right.
Because they're so used to just executing on this muscle memory that the boss has done something unpredictable, and they're not that good at the game. They're just good at memorizing. And so you can tell who's really good or who's just like on autopilot because the boss punishes you, and I like that.
Oh. Sorry, guys. Hold on a second.
By far.
Oh, I think the call cut out for a second. Maybe it was my internet. Hello, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I think. Are we good?
Okay, I think so too. I think this.
I don't remember what I said.
We were talking about bloat and how you like the random punishing mechanic. But
yeah, I think he's one of the best designed bosses in old school. And I would love a boss that takes Pestilent Bloat and like quadruples his hit points and adds like a few more mechanics to make it truly a random experience. Like maybe you quadruple the size of the arena and you add some depth in what kind of path Bloat can take and deciding which way you should run. Like think like what if he runs to the center, then you have to keep an eye on him. Which way is he going to go? Right? There's so much potential with just that general concept of a random NPC.
Yeah. Apparently with the wilderness rework and we're kind of getting off topic here, but apparently there's supposed to be the new wilderness bosses, the reworks of them, they're supposed to have more random mechanics. Allegedly, I thought that's what they said in the post. But who knows what's actually going to happen with that, right?
I'm excited to see Raids 3 next week, I think, because
Yeah.
they learned so much from Theater of Blood, and each of their raids has gotten progressively better. Like Theater of Blood was
Yeah.
notably more fun than Chambers of Xeric to me, so I'm curious to see what they can pull
Oh
off.
yeah, Theater of Blood's way more fun than Chambers of Xeric. Yeah.
Way more fun. So I'm fully expecting this raid to be
I'm
very,
excited
very
too, but
enjoyable.
I'm probably not going to be able to try it. I've been bonding off of my old school main for so
Mhm.
long that I have like 70 mil left. So I don't think I'm really going to be able to do that. But I'm working on an old school Iron Man series on the side, so eventually then I'd be able to try that out. But I agree, and well, another thing that I kind of wanted to talk about in the second half of this, but it feels like the old school team like something I appreciate about the old school team is it feels like they constantly improve on like their mistakes, I guess, or previous things. Like I think the perfect example is the skilling boss thing, right? Like they came out with Wintertodd, and Wintertodd was terrible, right? Like it's just like nobody likes Wintertodd, right? It's just a grind fest. You're just the fastest fire making XP in the game. Then they come out with, I think Zalcano was the next one, right? And that was better. Like I don't particularly like Zalcano, but it was certainly better, right? And it seemed like they kind of it felt more like a skilling boss
Yeah.
rather than just grinding fire making. You know what I mean? And then they came out with Temperos, right? Which I think they did the best job of, right? Out of all three of those. I've only done a little bit of Temperos, but it actually feels like a boss, right? Like in the way that you're doing it, right? You have to pay attention to the mechanics. It's pretty simple, but at the same time, it's still it feels like an entry level boss, right?
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, it's rewarding, but it's not overpowered, right? It's not Croesus drop table, right? It's like it's rewarding in that it's not a waste of your time to do. Like there's alternatives that you could do that might be slightly more efficient, but it's not a waste of your time. But you know, it's still rewarding, but it's not completely overpowered. You know what I mean? And I really like that with that. And like you said with raids too, like Theater Blood was a huge improvement, I think, over over Chambers. But at the same time, I think people still missed a little bit of that randomness, which it looks like they're trying to introduce with Raids 3. You know what I mean? Because again, like
Yeah.
Theater Blood is actually more scripted than, well, sort of. Like Chambers,
The
you just kind
bosses
of
are scripted, yeah.
yeah. But also with like the bosses in Chambers are pretty scripted, but also like I was gonna say that the order is random, but people usually just go for the optimal order anyways. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, they'll scout for something easy, which defeats the purpose.
But I
The
hope
thing
they
with
did good.
Chambers,
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say
Go ahead.
that the thing with Chambers is that they really modeled it off Dungeoneering, and I feel like that choked the identity just a little bit because it was like they were trying to bring Dungeoneering to old school, but also make it a raid, and it had a bit of a mishmash of thematics and goals.
Yeah.
But like it was their first try, and ultimately it's one of the most engaged with piece of content in old school. Like it
Yeah.
really truly is really fun for so many people to give it a try,
And,
and
and
it's
it's fun
reasonably
for a
accessible.
lot of level brackets too. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can get involved in some complex raiding with reasonable stats that are achievable, and you have a reason to do it with friends.
Yeah.
And that does a good job of just like giving people something to work towards. Um, no, it's they did a good job with it, and I don't know if there's something as similar in RS3 that kind of hits the mark the way Chambers of Xeric does for me. Maybe I'm just being
Yeah.
biased against
I think a
the
lot of
team, but I can't
people
think of anything.
a lot of people I think would compare like elite dungeons to raids. You know what I mean?
Right.
Which from I haven't done a lot of like or I haven't done full elite dungeon runs on my Iron Man or anything yet, but from what I can tell, um, it I don't know it doesn't feel the same from the little bit of like trash runs I've done and the little bit of things that I've watched. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel the same to me. I don't know. What do you think about elite dungeons?
Honestly, this is weird to say, but I've never completed a full elite dungeon.
Oh,
I don't
really?
know. It just yeah,
Never
that's weird
piqued
to
your
say 'cause
interest or what?
I don't know. It's just I guess it's just like nothing about it really intrigues me. Maybe it's just because so much of your time is spent clearing trash mobs, and the combat system is inherently unfun. So clearing trash mobs to me isn't
It
entertaining.
just
Like
feels
it's
like
just like
work.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't care to do it. So maybe that's why I never really got into the idea. But like I'm just generally biased because I just don't find EOC to be sufficiently fun. Um, that said, I've done a good number of bosses. I think recently I did the Zuck with one defense. It was a little bit challenging, but I don't know. It's just
Sure.
not as fun. I always find myself more interested in what old school bosses are doing.
Yeah. And it's weird to say too, because like I think a lot of people look at the old school combat system as, you know, outdated or super basic or whatever, right? And it's true that the way that you interact with mechanics are a little bit buggy and weird. You know what I mean? Like prayer flicking is just kind of like a weird thing. You know what I mean? But at the same time, it feels like I don't know. I don't know how to explain it either. You know what I mean? Like
I think
it's just I don't know how to explain it either. I think maybe that I think it might just be that even though the old school system is outdated and weird, it's consistent. You know what I mean? Right? Like
well, it's thematic, right? There's a fantasy there. When I say to you old school RuneScape, a thought pops up in your head. You think
right.
Dragon Dagger, you think Ice Barrage, you think Armadillo Godsword, Dragon Claws. Like these are like iconic things about the combat system. And you
Absolutely.
think whipping something nonstop. Or you think whipping out a crystal bow and shooting it all day. Like
Right.
you have this thought in your head that comes into play, and the bosses and the mechanics that they introduce don't deviate from that. They just kind of extend it in an
Yeah.
interesting way. Whereas there's nothing iconic with EOC for me to latch onto. Like your base magic rotation, I don't care. Like I'm
Yeah.
not nostalgic or like excited to think about wild magic as a threshold ability or sunshine. Like it doesn't
You don't think Wild
it's not
Magic is one
iconic.
of the best looking and feeling abilities in the
I
game?
don't. It's not. But we were talking about ultimates earlier. They're just not like these. They're not iconic, and them
No.
not being iconic means I don't feel particularly interested using them. Um, but an Armadillo Godsword special attack in old school RuneScape will never not be
And it feels
amazing.
amazing. Or Dragon Claws, right? The classic Dragon. It's just like
Yeah,
every time, it just like that dopamine hits. You know what I mean? And you're just like, you know, it just feels great. Or yeah, Ice Barrage. You know?
the Ice Barrage sound makes people feel a
Oh
certain type
yeah,
of way.
puts
It's
you
just
gives you shivers. You know what I mean?
just a
Like
little
oh
bit,
shit,
right?
who's here?
It doesn't matter if you haven't touched RuneScape in years. If
Oh
you just
yeah.
randomly hear the Ice Barrage sound, you like that's a like a deep fear that gets reignited inside you.
I was
And
actually
that's theme. That's player fantasy.
oh yeah, I was actually thinking about adding that to my stream as like one of those things that people can like cash in like channel points or whatever for. You know what I mean? That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah,
But yeah,
play the
it's
sound.
just so iconic. But also I'd say that just like the combat system in old school again is just is consistent. You know what I mean? Like even though it's and to me it like there are some quirks with it, but they always work the same way. You know what I mean? And
It's intuitive. There's
yeah,
clunky glitches to it, but even like things like tick eating and prayer flicking, you don't have to do them to
no,
do any of the content. I didn't prayer flick through Inferno. I just did it like
just
did the
wait for
thing.
SGS specs.
Well, yes, some of the times I
Yeah.
did, but I also did what's called lazy flicking nowadays,
Oh, okay.
um,
Yeah, yeah.
which to me actually
That's how I did
has
most of my Inferno, anyways. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I honestly think the like prayer flick where you're just clicking the thing over and over again is stupid and shouldn't be a thing. Um,
Yeah. I
because
think you
with
said
lazy
that.
flicking, yeah, you have to be mindful of the timing of yourself and the things hitting you. Like you can't just like permanently have rigor plus your protection prayer active. You're either giving up rigor because you have to flick.
Yeah.
You have to.
You have to
Yeah,
turn it
you get
on
what
at
I
the
mean.
right tick, and then if you don't turn it off right away, then you still consume prayer points. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
Hmm.
fine to me. But like it's just more intuitive. I can bring a friend. Or sorry, I can have a friend watch me do an old school raid and they'll understand what's going on just because it's so easy to consume and it's not super complicated.
Other than this is actually a discussion I had, I think, in the clan chat like yesterday. What about Olm? Do you think Olm is intuitive?
Every single time I've brought someone to come and learn Olm, they pick it up reasonably quickly, I think.
You think so? I
Yeah,
guess
I think it's
I guess that maybe the argument we were having in the clan chat was that maybe the optimal way of doing Olm isn't intuitive, right?
yes. Yeah, with the head running stuff.
Like nobody's gonna figure out 4 to 1 like by themselves. You know what I mean?
No, but that's
Um,
not the that's not necessary. Like
Right.
I would duo with a friend who doesn't play RuneScape very much, and maybe we did 3-4 kills, but we were just doing like standard Olm the way people did it maybe a year
Right, and
after
you
it was
just deal
released.
with the
No head running,
mechanics.
just deal with the mechanics, and it was
Right.
pretty straightforward. We got clean kills. They picked it up. I
Right.
did call out. I would say, crystals are coming up soon. Get ready, and then they would move.
Right.
Yeah, obviously, super hyper optimized strategies are not going to be intuitive, but
Right.
I don't think they ever are in any game ever.
Yeah, they don't, and that doesn't need to be, right?
No, that's fine. It's fine to have sweaty optimizations that end game players like. I have no issues with that. It's more so that barrier of entry to get to the point where you're like, okay, I've learned the content, and now I'm going to go look up this stuff because I want to take it a step further, rather than I don't know what's going on and I'm going to look up stuff because
you need
my auto attack
to
did
do
weird
anything.
things.
Right, right, exactly. Like, why can't I use this vulnerability spell? You know what I mean? Like we were talking about earlier. Yeah, and I think that's the big point is, yeah, just making things more intuitive. And how I don't know, how would you do that with RS3? How would you make the combat system more intuitive if you could?
The only solution is to redo it.
Seriously,
Right,
but
like
but
they
how?
have to redo it.
Right,
How?
I know that's what you preach. You're basically preaching evolution of combat 2.0, right,
Yes,
in your
yeah.
videos, right? But like, what do you think the solution is for, making the system more intuitive?
Yeah, I think if there was a trivial solution, I would have already shared it.
Right.
When people are designing a game, they are in R&D mode for years because they're trialing different things. They come up with a design, they prototype it, and they test it, and then they iterate on it. And they don't actually share it with the public because it's never going to be in a state where you're ready to share it up until you're super confident in that design and in that prototype. Then maybe you'll consider sharing it, but that usually comes in years ahead. So it's really hard for me to say, oh, I have this solution that I've already designed. Here you go.
You
The
didn't
game is
just
now
you didn't
fixed.
just draw something up last night? What the hell?
No, but I think we can look at the high level goals that you would set when you're designing a combat system that kind of better hits the head, like the nail of what the combat system should have been reworked to. And I see that high level goal as how do we take what's iconic about RuneScape in general, including old school and including some stuff that EOC introduced, and modernize it in a way that makes sense for players such that when you log on to this new combat system and you play it, and let's say you've known RuneScape all your life since you were 10 years old, you can feel like this is familiar, like it's something that you kind of understand intuitively because you just know and understand and love RuneScape, and it's doing cool things with iconic memories you have, like with Ice Barrage, and yet there's some depth to it because you're doing things, or you have there's ways to use these tools that they've given you in interesting ways.
Right.
It's a very generic way of phrasing it, but that to me that would be the high level goal of a system that appeals to old school RuneScape players in a way that feels like it's a modern reimagining of what they're used to, and it wouldn't overlap with what old school offers either. Whereas I think EOC initially tried to be just this total baseline reimagination of what combat is without the context of what's RuneScape, and then they kind of walked it back to sort of be kind of what old school offers you. So we ended up with EOC with a little bit of flavor of pre-EOC, and there's just no identity.
Sometimes it feels like they took the game from pre-EOC and then just kind of unnecessarily overcomplicated it. You know what I mean?
Well, they did. Okay, here's a simple example of how they didn't consider the theme of RuneScape. Do you remember the EOC beta?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They
I was like in middle
renamed
school, but
ancients.
yeah, I remember.
Yeah, I was like 18 years old. They renamed ancient spells.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that's like a forgotten piece of history, but they renamed them for like a year or two. Shadow Barrage was renamed to Rock Barrage. Like, they took something iconically RuneScape and just randomly changed it for no good reason.
Right.
But the fact that that made it through the design step and it got signed off on means that there wasn't anyone saying, is it thematic for us to change this? And when you consider something as simple as a name change past the check, think about how the complex design of the combat system didn't go through that check either.
Right. Or everything.
So
Yeah.
Everything, yeah, the whole combat system, even dual wielding. I honestly think that's so like anti RuneScape, and even today, dual wielding offers nothing to the game
Yeah.
at all.
And also, like, talking about thematics, right? Is just that, like, dual wielding doesn't thematically make any sense, right?
No,
Like, like if you're talking about, like, imagine you're a ranger, right? It's like you're not gonna have a crossbow in each hand. How the hell are you gonna reload them? You know what I mean? Do you, like, if you know how a crossbow works, like, it just kind of looks weird, right? Like you're shooting off a crossbow like it's a pistol or something, right? And I understand there's magical elements and stuff like that. You know what I mean? The only case that like dual wielding actually feel like it makes sense is like with melee to me. But even then, it just feels again like you talk about in your theming video today. There's no abilities that really highlight dual wielding, right?
no,
Like,
you don't feel like you're dual wielding when you're dual wielding.
right.
You literally just hold it as a stat stick.
Except maybe like concentrated blast or something. I like, you know what I mean? It's like you're kind of throwing shit out both hands. You know what I mean? And it kind of like, uh, but for the most part, it's like most of your ability interactions and whatnot come from the primary hand. And you're right. Like, actually, I didn't even think about it until you said it in your video today. Was that offhands in RS3 basically function the same as defenders in old school? You know
Same
what I mean?
thing.
It's literally like I didn't
Literally
think
the
about
same
it though.
thing.
It's just that they're
Yeah.
stronger, right?
And then
Like,
you get access to a couple abilities, but like half of them are junk garbage, and the other half, like, it's not thematically interesting enough to like it. It's equivalent to the defender giving you extra damage in old school. Like fundamentally, it's the same, right? You get an ability that's just a bland damage ability that just increases your damage.
yeah.
It's the same thing. There's no gameplay behind dual wielding. It doesn't unlock anything.
Right. It doesn't change how you play the game either. Like, you know what I mean? Like you said with
And
the
that's why
abilities. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why people get confused early game. They're like, they don't realize that they need an offhand because that shield is doing nothing for them, or like not much thematically changes
Yeah.
about wielding that offhand, and yet
It's
they're
just a
missing out on a ton of damage.
baseline. You know what I mean? Having two
Exactly,
weapons. Yeah.
and that's the issue with the theme. The reason 12-year-olds on the RuneScape forums wanted dual wielding because they thought they could double their dragon longsword damage. Obviously, they can't do that,
Yeah.
so it just didn't serve anything because dual wielding just becomes, like you said, that baseline of what's standard damage, and then it's compared to a two-handed weapon, which is the same damage, and all you've done is take shields and chuck them into the garbage because they're garbage. Um, Someone in chat said they wanted it so you can use a sword and a crossbow. I feel like they talked about the possibilities of that, but it was more like, yeah, you can equip a melee hand and a ranged hand in your offhand, but they didn't define like a purpose or a theme or
Right.
gameplay behind
That
that.
doesn't
It's
mean you
just something that
should. It's like
Yeah,
yeah, I can, like, you know.
if you've ever played Arcage,
I haven't, but
have you? Okay,
no.
so the way Arcage works is instead of a class, you pick 3 skill trees of, I think there's like 12. So that's
Okay.
how many combinations there are. That's how many classes there are. So there's like 350 something classes as a result of the 3 skill trees that you pick.
Sure.
But one of the skill trees is like a magic tree. One of them is a ranged tree. One of them is a melee tree. You don't want to pick the magic tree, the melee and the ranged tree. Like you can, but you're not kind of optimizing yourself.
Right.
You're doing 3 different things, so it doesn't really work. So I see dual wielding where you have a different style on the other hand, kind of the same way. Like, yeah, it's always been a possibility, but there was no way you can ever make that work ever. It's always going to be suboptimal. I've never seen a game pull it off successfully where you can be 2 styles at once without having the player actually totally switch. Like in old
Right.
school RuneScape, you switch styles, right?
I'm
Not like I'm both a ranger and melee at the same time, unless that's a defined specific class.
yeah. I'm I mean, honestly, if somebody were able to design something like that, I'd be really impressed. You know what I mean? Um,
I I've I I love the idea of like I've seen it executed through something like there's a class called Dagger Spell because it's a combination of a sorcery tree and like an assassiny tree, but it kind of works because the
mhm.
assassiny tree isn't pure melee. It's more like a auxiliary tree, so you're still doing dagger things, but you can also do mage things, and that works. But you can't have like a strongly typed class matched with another strongly typed class. There's just a clash of
Right.
thematics. It doesn't work unless you're specifically designing for a class that's meant to be like if you saw my video, the Lost Ark class, where I'm a ranger, but I go into melee range sometimes to get off like a few daggery things.
Right.
but I doubt I'll ever see something where it's like I am using a giant 2H sword and then I'm also using a crossbow in my other hand at the same time. It's just a thematic clash.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah. Elarax in the chat. He says, "What's this login screen, my friend?
Keep-
This is from what 2010, something like that. Oh, it's the memories.
I
But
thought you were just using the HDOS client.
no. This is a screenshot from like the 2010 login screen or whatever. Is this what it looks like in the HDOS
Yes.
client? Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, the HDOS client is phenomenal. If you want to play
I
old
want to
school,
check
but
it
like
out. Yeah.
it's so good. It's an official client, so it's like totally legit.
I've seen a few
It is.
videos, and that's what gave me like super big nostalgia because that's when I started playing RuneScape. Was like 2009, right? And that was
Yeah.
like through back memories to killing cows and shit.
Yeah, I would download it. It slaps.
I'll have to check it out. Anyways, let's talk about movement and your proposal for changing up movements
Yes.
in
Yes.
RuneScape because I really that was I think my favorite video of the ones you uploaded. And again, for anyone watching, like they'll get caught up on the semantics of numbers and values and stuff like that. But can you summarize for us, like kind of what your for somebody who hasn't watched before,
Yes.
what your
Yeah,
proposal
yeah.
for changing movement is?
So the proposal that I came up with is also just like it's an example. It's not necessarily the right thing. I don't want someone
Yeah.
to think like, hey, this guy thinks that he knows what's up.
Yeah. Again, don't get caught up on the details
Yes.
and the semantics. It's
Yeah.
more a high level thing. Yeah.
The idea is mobility in RuneScape is not strongly defined. There's no system or framework that supports it, and we have a skill that doesn't have anything to do with mobility. So right now in RuneScape, the mobility comes from abilities like Surge and Bladed Dive, but all classes use them in kind of the same ways, and there's no progression that's like adequately defined given that we have a skill based around leveling up your movement ability. It doesn't help you move during combat or throughout the game. So the general idea is let's introduce a system that better supports all of that, and then lets us introduce unique combat tools for each class to fit into a theme, like we learned from this recent episode, and a playstyle that's unique to that combat class, and kind of splits the combat styles a little bit so you don't feel like you're doing the same thing and they're not kind of digging into each other's tools inappropriately. But the proposal introduces a new resource, stamina, which I know some people will say, well, why not just use run energy? And the reason I don't use run energy is because it's existing in a space that leverages a ton of content that interacts with run energies in ways that I don't want to repurpose. So it's not worth it. Basically, let
Yeah.
run energy be run energy.
Sure.
So you introduce a new resource called stamina, and whenever you use one of the mobility tools you have available to you, it consumes a certain amount of stamina. So the more maximum stamina you have, the more like charges of mobility you have, and stamina would regenerate over time, and that defines your cooldown. So we define charges of how much burst mobility do I have by how much maximum stamina you have, and you define how often can I use mobility through how quickly does it recharge. And then we get rid of Surge and we get rid of Bladed Dive and all that junk, and we introduce like a generic movement tool that's available to everyone through the agility skill. And as someone levels up agility, that ability gets stronger. So maybe it starts off as like you can only move 3 tiles or 4 tiles, but by level 80 agility, you can move 7 or 8, or the cooldown goes.
Well, I liked your idea
down,
of as your agility goes up, your stamina consumption goes down. That's what your proposal was. But basically like say your base stamina is 100, right? And then if if you're level 80 agility, maybe this ability, I forget what you called it, but maybe it consumes 20.
Like dive or something.
But when
like
you
that.
first unlock it at level 10 agility, it's 50 or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what we're basically saying is the amount of burst mobility you have access to increases as your agility level increases. And you can do that different ways. Maybe you reduce the cost of it, or maybe you increase how much maximum stamina the player has. Like immediately it starts to make sense how many ways we can leverage the tools I've just introduced, right? Like the framework of the system starts to almost define itself because it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And it fits so well into the theme of the game. And then like if you want to retain something like Surge in the game, you just add it as another agility movement skill that also consumes X stamina, and that inherently limits it. Like we don't have to worry about introducing too many because you can't chain them because your gate is how much maximum stamina you have. So I could give you 500 movement abilities now. It doesn't matter. I don't have to worry about them and how they interact. Whereas right now, you kind of do. You have to say, should Surge and Escape share a cooldown, for example? And then the
Right.
rest of the video just kind of goes over how to repurpose certain existing tools to fit the stamina system. And then it introduces 3 examples of an ability that costs stamina for each combat style to kind of define a play style. But that video, I honestly think it's my favorite too in terms of just overall design cohesion. And I find that people that are focused on how RuneScape currently is don't like it, but people that
I think people
appreciate
just don't want to
design
train
think.
agility.
Well, that's why I emphasize. I was like, I think that if you get like 75 agility, like you've mostly achieved what you need to achieve. It shouldn't scale to 99 aggressively, but it gets a really positive response from people who like to have design conversations because I think they see the value of how you could then use that system to design a boss, for example. Like maybe a boss can mess with your maximum stamina. It has a phase where it starts draining your stamina quickly or something, or a phase where it cuts your maximum stamina in half. Like you can do fun things with that system now as a boss designer, whereas right now, how do you manipulate a player's mobility in an intuitive way?
Right. Especially with what we were talking about kind of like introducing more random boss mechanics, right? Like these mobility tools are kind of a way of dealing with that, right? Like a way of
Yes.
being able to reposition yourself quickly or whatever, right? And then, so having more randomness, and then all of a sudden, you have half stamina, so you have to be more, again, increasing more depth because you have to think about when you're using your movement ability, right? Again, kind of going back to League, or again, I've never played League, but I played Smite, and I assume it works the same way, right? A lot of characters have a movement ability, right?
Yes.
And a lot of times, if you get caught out without that movement ability, it's extremely punishing, right? Like you can just
Exactly.
just die, right? So you have to be really smart about when you use your movement ability. You know what I mean? Like that's at least how it worked in Smite. I assume it's the same way in League, right? If you have a blink or a jump or whatever, or you know what I mean, a dash, and it was different from characters, so it still felt unique, right? And then it gets even more in depth when maybe sometimes you're incentivized to use a movement ability aggressively, right? Like I remember in Smite there were certain characters whose, like especially support characters, whose movement ability was some sort of crowd control, like a knock up or something, like say you jump and knock everybody up, right? So it's like that's incredibly valuable, but you have to really think carefully about when you're going to use that, because if your team's not with you, if you get caught out of position, whatever, you die. And I agree with you that in a PvE sense, you know what I mean, or a PvM sense, that could be implemented in some ways where you could in some way incentivize someone to use their movement ability, but also they need to understand that, they could get punished for that,
Yeah, and that's the example that I gave in the episode I dropped today, where the ranger class that I was playing has a movement ability that if you use it to hit something, you gain adrenaline relatively, or whatever, identity gauge. So it's like, do you save it to dodge a boss mechanic, or do you use it to be aggressive, put yourself in a bad position to potentially give you DPS? And that becomes a skill expression piece because the player
Right.
who's really good is going to use that tool correctly. They know when to save it and they know when to use it for DPS.
Yep.
And I like that. I want to see more of that in RuneScape because I don't think we have enough of it right now. It's too easy to solve a boss, and it's too easy to solve the set of abilities we have.
Well, I don't know if it's easy to solve a boss because the bosses are a lot of times, again, unintuitive. But again, once it is solved, it's then just a matter of like, okay, can I do the APM necessary to repeat this script that Eva Lucario posted on YouTube, right?
Yes.
Can like, that's something I kind of realized too when I was comparing your video, and I watched, I think, an Eva Lucario video where he was talking about Telos, right? Because that's obviously kind of his thing, right? Is that with Telos, it's like he has it down to such a science that with his rotations, right? That he's like, basically just teleport out if you like miss this ability, right? Because he knows exactly, he's like, if he does this rotation every single time, he's always going to phase one after this mechanic. And then phase 2 is always going to phase after this mechanic, right? And then phase 3 is always going to phase after this mechanic. So it's literally just the same thing. You know what I mean? And
It's Guitar Hero, right? Like that's what it turns into.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, yeah. But then if you miss one button, then you die. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Teleport out if you miss one of the keys that's coming towards you.
Right, right. And I like the idea of kind of introducing more, not complexity again, but depth, where there's more decision making. I guess something that again is maybe controversial, but maybe more reactive versus proactive gameplay. You know what I mean? Where it's like, okay, I'm using this resource because a boss did this, not because I know the boss is going to do this.
Yes. Or you assess the possibilities and you determine if it's potentially optimal to use a tool in a certain way. And the really skilled player is going to recognize better when something is optimal and how it's optimal
Sure.
versus I know it's optimal because I literally did it last fight and it worked the same way and I'm going to do it again.
Right. And I'm 30 seconds into this fight, so that's when you do this thing.
Yeah,
Speaking,
like Crosis is totally scripted.
Right, right. But speaking of bosses that are more random, what do you think about Glaciar?
Yeah, so if you look at each mechanic in a vacuum, they're dealt with the exact same way every single time. So really the only depth comes from what mechanic is he going to use next. And that only really comes into play for maybe the first 2 or 3. And then 4 and 5 you can kind of predict it. And it's also you see it coming so early because you can kind of tell what mechanics coming based on how the kind of ice is going, which isn't inherently problematic.
No, I don't think that's a problem for reactive gameplay.
No.
You talked about that earlier about like with Raksha, for example. You're saying randomize the mechanics, but make them more, or I should say make the window to react larger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With Glaciar, it's like the individual mechanics themselves aren't that interesting to deal with. And because you deal with them the same way, I think people interpret the fight as very tedious because it's also combined with an enrage system, which really incentivizes grinding it nonstop. And yes, there's some depth in going, oh, he might use mechanic A, so I should be concerned, or have some tool available to me, which is good to see. I just don't think the application of it is as intense as I was hoping for. Especially because each of the mechanics is dealt with the exact same way every time. Like the pillar movement stuff.
Yeah.
You know exactly where to stand when it spawns.
Yeah,
you
that's
know
what
exactly
I saw
where
when.
to move.
Yeah.
Right? Like
when I looked
you
up a video, yeah.
it.
Yeah, when I first tried hard mode, I was like I was kind of running around like a chicken with my head cut off. But then I watched a video and they're like, oh yeah, stand on this square, go this way at a 45-degree angle or whatever.
But then go do Verzik phase 3 20% HP, and that's chaos because you're not always necessarily in the same position because maybe something happened throughout the fight that puts you in a weird one.
Yeah.
And when I was watching people fail that pillar mechanic, the only thing that ran into my head was some of you guys have never done Theater of Blood, and it shows. Like, it's so standard to avoid this pillar chasing you in old school that seeing it in RS3 in a way that's scripted and people still struggled with it, I was like, yo.
Oh yeah.
So I love Verzik's implementation.
Verzik is still a pretty scripted fight, I would say, up until phase 3, right?
Yeah, well, even phase 3
is mostly, but the things do get a little bit weird when tornadoes come out. You know what I mean?
That's exactly it. When the tornadoes come out and that speaks to, for me, a lot of depth and decision making comes when boss mechanics start to overlap. Because when you deal with a mechanic individually, like Verzik phase 3, you know what attack is coming. It's number 4. You deal with it the same way. It becomes a lot less stressful to manage it because there's less decision making. This mechanic requires you to press a red button, so you press the red button. But when you get thrown into something like Olm, which can randomly, if you're not doing the head run, it can randomly screw you with like 4 mechanics at the same time. That's, I think, where a player's skill is tested. So honestly, when I saw Glaciar like shown to me, and they were showing normal mode was like you deal with these 5 mechanics, I thought hard mode was gonna have you deal with 2 or 3 mechanics at a time, and I thought that would have been interesting because think of the possible combinations of mechanics you can deal with. What if you had to deal with the frozen core and the pillar at the same time? Right? Like, what if you had to deal with minions and pillars?
But then obviously those would be less punishing
overlap
individually, right?
Yes,
but
exactly.
Yeah.
I was fully expecting at 1,000% enrage a second Glaciar would appear on the other side and you had to deal with 2 at the same time. Like that was what was in my mind.
Yeah.
I honestly thought that was gonna happen. I was like, that's gonna happen. You're gonna have to deal with the frost cannon and ice pillars at the same time. Like, I thought they were gonna do wacky stuff like that. It just didn't happen. And I was like, damn it.
Yeah, didn't the first people get to 4,000% within a couple days with Arch Glaciar, or didn't
4,000% I think took like a month or so,
a
but that
month?
was
Yeah,
a it took a month only because I think people didn't have a lot of the gear that they have now, like Crypt Bloom and
yeah,
whatnot, and it's just scaled so ridiculously that you had to do really
right.
cheesy
Isn't
stuff
isn't
to actually
isn't four
crack
thousand
damage.
percent kills? Aren't don't they take like 30 minutes or something like that? Isn't that
Yes, because
right?
his health keeps scaling up. So it was a
Right.
mix of like
So even
figuring
if you're
out.
grinding from 0 to 4,000, knowing exactly what to do, it might take you a couple weeks, anyways. Huh?
Yeah, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of like ways to mess up because being tick perfect for 30 minutes is hard. I don't know if
Right.
people liked it. I don't know if people like the 4K grind.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I appreciate and like the attempt, and ultimately it was designed for early game players. Like it was designed to get people into bossing, so I'm not that shocked they didn't go all out. But I think if at 100% they should have done something where mechanics started to overlap. That would have
Sure.
been more interesting to me.
I think the
Mr.
concept of having a boss that kind of teaches you PVM is a good thing. But again, as kind of like a newer player, Arch Glacier just kind of felt weird to me once I started doing 5 mechanic and stuff. Like it just felt weird, like clunky almost, just because the thing that threw me off the most was just the like immunity frames and stuff, like, or not immunity frames, but just like it feels like he's immune for like so long,
Yeah,
right? And that felt really frustrating to me. It's like okay, I figured out, okay, you resonance the cannon or you devotion the cannon, right? But then it's like okay, the pillars are coming up, right? The ones that you're supposed to run away from. It's like, why can't I attack the boss? You know what I mean? Like, or I don't think he's immune, but you can't target him for like the first
yeah,
like
he's like
10 seconds. It's
weirdly out of
weird.
range.
It's really weird. Like if you start an asphyxiate, you can still keep damaging him, right? Like after that, but you can't target him again. You know what I mean? After that, for like another ability. So it just felt really weird to me. And again, coming from old school, it's like what, I can't declaw spec Verzik while the tornadoes are out. You know what I mean? Like what the hell? You know,
I
it
think
just kind
she's
of felt
immune
weird.
when she's walking to the center during web phase trigger. She's immune,
Okay, but that's like
but that kind
one
of
phase transition.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
it's
I think
yeah.
what you're essentially saying is that random immunity feels kind of like crap, and
Yeah.
that's a consequence of okay, let's make a boss random, but let's also introduce immunity frames without recognizing that there's a big opportunity for players to kind of feel really bad about it.
Mhm.
So it all just comes down to how the boss was designed. Like take away all immunity frames, pretend like the boss was never immune. How much would the fight reasonably change? Is it just were they worried about people killing it too fast, so the immunity was meant to
Yeah,
draw out
maybe.
the fight? I don't know, but then why not just give him more hit points and let people do damage, right? Like
Right.
there's different ways of achieving the same targets that or the design goals that they had without necessarily introducing immunity frames. But I don't know what their logic for it was.
Mhm.
But it's very clear that people find them frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I think there's different ways to approach things, right? Um, and yeah, I think that it was maybe not the greatest implementation of a random mechanic, because like you said, with the random, you were kind of expecting something like Ulm, where you can get all these mechanics thrown at you at once.
Yes.
No one of them one shots you, right? But if you get comboed out or something like that, there's a lot to
Yeah.
deal with, and it's a little bit chaotic. And I think it's a good design. Like your first time doing Ulm is certainly a very chaotic experience, and it's very engaging in that way. You know what I mean? Obviously, once you start doing a ton of solos and you're just forward, it's just kind of repetitive. But your first time doing it is this chaotic experience. But again, it's intuitive. You can figure it out, right? It's like, okay, this crystal's coming up from my feet, right? It makes sense that I shouldn't stand there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
It makes sense. Like you don't even need to have description text most of the time to figure out what's going on.
No, and the Ulm. So Carapac, right? He has
I
that
know
lightning
of
wall that
him.
everyone hates.
It
So
looks like the
I don't
hitbox
know.
is really weird on it from the videos that I've seen.
It's really bad. It was even worse on release.
Really?
But the excuse of it was, well, we can't design visuals because we have a tile system and it makes it really hard. And my response to that is, why can old school do it,
Yeah,
right?
that's
And
like every mechanic in old school is like that, right? Or like
yeah,
something like that. Yeah. Uh huh.
but Ulm has a lightning wall. Like it's literally the same
Oh
mechanic.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Right? He has a lightning wall. It existed in old school for like 5 years
Right.
before Fairpack hit
So does
live.
QBD. Well, it's base
Uh,
QBD is basically the same thing, but yeah.
QBD basically has the same thing, yeah.
Uh
So
huh.
it's like they use this excuse. I think that someone at Jagex has set this high level like design requirement of we shouldn't reveal that we have a tile system in our
Mm-hmm.
like game. Like that's not okay for us to reveal to players.
It's okay
And
that
so
it's
they
there, but it shouldn't feel like it's there. You know?
exactly.
Yeah.
And so the visuals that they design, they don't adequately communicate this tile is dangerous, this tile is not dangerous. If you take Carapax's Lightning Wall and redesign it exactly to look like Olm's, it doesn't matter if it's 1 by 1 or 50 by 50 because
Right.
every individual tile plays its own lightning animation. So you can very clearly tell which tile is and isn't threatening.
Yeah.
And the way Olm does it is it flashes and then it moves forward. So you can kind of infer its path. But I think people would feel less bad getting hit by it if the threatening tiles were more clearly defined. And you can't do that when you try to design like circle of area effects or the weird
Right.
line that they went for. It doesn't. It's just not it, and it
Well,
frustrates
I
people.
think I think a big issue with the tile system is in RuneScape is that when they try to do diagonals, right? That seems to cause a lot of issues, right? Real quick, EC Legacy says you wants to know about our thoughts about fresh start worlds. We'll be getting into that, and like that will be one of the things in the later half of this. But yeah, with diagonals, things get really wonky, right? With the tile system, it feels like even a good example that's kind of simple, but that I notice a lot is with Croesus, right? Like when I'm trying to go towards the mid for Croesus, right? Like a lot of times it's hard to determine where that actually is and what tile is actually adjacent, and then all of a sudden I'm one tile away, right? And I lose like 50 points or whatever, right? Because it's on an angle, right? So the actual adjacent
That map
tiles it feels weird. You know what I mean?
it's hard to process it
Yeah.
too. Because, like in old school, you can at least tell where the tiles are because they're more
It's
intense
more
with it, so it's
simplified,
okay.
right? And it's
Yeah.
yeah. Uh-huh.
So it's you're right. I always mess up Croesus because the map is on an angle and I don't know what's
Right.
going on. It's weird. It
Yeah.
throws me off every time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
the hardmode Zuck firewall is also terrible. Um, it's always coming at you at a diagonal, and watching people try to dodge it, they just get absolutely destroyed. So
Yeah.
those are just examples of how there's like a conflicting visual design requirement with like gameplay expectations. Like whoever said don't leverage tile system or tile effects is actively hurting the gameplay experience for
What do you mean by
all
that?
the players. Meaning it like every game sets visual standards for what their game should look like, right? And if you look at RuneScape 3, it's like someone doesn't want visual effects to be tile based,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like think of like Dragon Breath.
Right.
Nothing about it in any way at all communicates what tiles it affects. And how many abilities do we have that actually really communicate these are the tiles that it's affected?
Right.
There's no visual effects that exist
And
on a
if you're
square,
stuck
right?
into the tile system, you might as well double down on it. You know what I mean? And just make it, you know.
I think the only a good example I can think of is if you've done Zuck, Haraken does this bombardment attack where he drops like an X on you,
Okay.
and that very clearly uses the tile system. Like they're tile based effects. It's never been ambiguous if you get hit by it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the only example I can think of where they actually do it.
Sure.
Someone correct me.
Yeah, I don't know. I agree that things feel just a little bit ambiguous. Another example, I was doing Vindicta on stream, like,
Oh god,
and
yes.
there was a bunch of times where I was like very clearly outside of the purple fire and still getting hit by it. You know what I mean? Like
The
visual.
reverse
I'm saying
happened.
visually, I was very clearly outside of it. You know?
I've had the reverse happen where I'm very clearly in it and I'm not taking damage, and it's because of
Right.
the way it gets laid out.
Again, at diagonals. You know what I mean? And whatnot. And it's
Yeah,
kind of
and they
like
try to make it a straight line, but it's not a straight line. It can't possibly be a straight
right.
line. So they have to just accept that you have a tile system. Either
Right.
wait until you fix the tile system, or just
Right. Either rework it
fine.
entirely or kind of double down onto it. Like, and I think old school does a good job of that. Like, you can still make stuff that's fits an aesthetic and is visually pleasing within that
Oh yeah,
tile
absolutely.
system. You know
I
what I
think
mean?
so.
It's a slightly different art style, but that's at the end of the day, that's all it is. You know what I mean? but I think having that visual feedback, and again having things be more intuitive, is really important. You know what I mean? Because it's to me, that's the most frustrating thing about, I guess if I could simplify as a newer player, what frustrates me about the RS3 combat system is just dying when it feels like you shouldn't have.
Yes.
Right? There's so many times where it's just like you die to something when you feel like it shouldn't have. Whether it be because Surge sends you in some weird janky direction that doesn't make any sense, right? Or you're getting hit by something that on the screen clearly shows you that you're like, you know, again, visually it looks like you're not getting hit by something. You know what I mean? Animation stalls is another one that you talked about, right?
Oh, like the canceling random.
No. Animation stalls, like an old school example would be like the Ice Barrage or Vengeance animation stall, right?
Oh, I don't think I talked.
You talked about it in one
Anyway,
video.
yeah.
I don't remember, but like I had an example. I was doing Beastmaster, right? And I was standing in the middle, and then all of a sudden I get hit by 3,000 melee attacks when there was an Eret nowhere around me, right? Like the closest,
yes.
the closest
NPCs being stuck. Yes.
the closest Eret was like 10, 20 feet away from me.
Yeah.
Right. And then all of a sudden I just died. Right. Like I just instantly died. You know what I mean? And that just feels so frustrating. Right. And especially I'm like in lunar armor. I'm Iron Man. Right. So I just like get deleted. Right. And it was just like, I was like, what the hell? Like there's nothing around me. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Honestly, speaking on that, I think kind of a good solution to that in an outdated system is something like the Chargers in Beastmaster, because they kind of like teleport to you, and that's their mechanic, right? Is they like dash to you. You know what I mean? Not saying that's a blanket solution for everything, but at least you're not getting hit from halfway across the map. You know what I mean? With a melee attack. Yeah.
Yeah, but even giving things a dash would be confusing because it's not actually dashing. It's like walking towards you at standard speed. It's just when it walks, it also plays an attack animation. You can't play the same at the two at the same time, but the server is updating its position, so it is moving towards you, but the NPC is not. So the simple solution is to just let it slide. Like just let the attack animation not stop the movement of the model.
Yeah.
It's fine. Like I'd rather just let it slide while it's poking me.
Oh, like you're saying like it might look weird because it's not walking. You're saying?
Right, like if you go to you know those little blobby boys from Zuck, when they spin, they don't move while they spin, but they're moving because they're always moving. Nothing actually stops them from moving. So they start spinning at you from like 8 tiles away. My point is just let it move while it's spinning. Like let the model itself move, because the server is saying that the NPC's positioning is updating.
Sure. Somebody said that in Final Fantasy 14, well, the comment's a little confusing, honestly, but he's basically talking about indicators for movements and animations. Yes. What do you think about that? Or do you think that's kind of like a blanket solution that might take away from the immersion?
So some people don't like that. Honestly, I think it's totally valid to normalize what a threat looks like. Mm-hmm. Because if you normalize what a threat looks like, such that like chat's saying, if you normalize what a threat looks like such that a player goes, if I'm in the indicator, I know I'm going to die, then that sets up the player to feel like they know what they need to do to not die. Sure. So the death doesn't feel like bullshit, because they're like, well, I shouldn't have stood in the indicator, my bad. Rather than RuneScape, where it's like, why did I just get nuked for 9k out of nowhere? Like, I don't know what killed me or why it killed me. So normalized indicators is really common in Lost Ark. Some people thought it looked silly because it was like, well, why is the boss telling you everything? And I'm thinking it lets them make the boss harder, because now you don't feel bad when you die because you feel like you messed up rather than the game did something that was...
Because it can kind of be infinitely difficult, because as long as all the information's on the table, then it's still fair, you know?
Yeah. You can go too far, but yes, generally,
right. You don't want to have some big flashing indicator like use this ability now, you know. But let's see. Your recent video, you talk about kind of like immersion and stuff. I would say, right? Like in general,
player fantasy.
Immersion's
a good example right? too. Yes.
Like immersion's how I would word it, right? Let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll move on to kind of like the second half of this. What do you think RuneScape needs to do to like feel better, as not necessarily from the combat system, but just like as an MMO or as an RPG, right? I think that's kind of what you're talking about in that video.
So that video, I wasn't talking about the game in general because I think it does a solid job of like the questing system is pretty solid.
I
The
guess what I
city,
meant, is that like, okay, dealing with the combat system, but makes it feel like it's an RPG, right? I think what I meant by like your first video is more about like
yes,
why combat feels bad mechanically, right? But what I
how do you
meant
make
by
combat
like a
thematic?
right, like why does it feel bad thematically?
You're asking why it feels bad thematically?
Yeah, why yeah,
There's no theme.
fair
Right?
enough.
Like what is the theme? Like you picked up dual crossbows. If I tell you, "Hey, here's a character that does dual crossbows."
Mm-hmm.
You think of something like pew 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 pew, right? That's what you're
Sure.
thinking of. You don't do that when you're actually going through combat animations. Visually you don't do that, but also the gameplay has nothing to do with dual crossbows. You're not like leveraging your offhand in like some cool way. There is an ability that's like, aim your offhand while you're running or something so that you can shoot while you're running. You know what I mean? Because
Right.
like there's some themes that aren't being explored because the game just doesn't do it. And that's true for all the combat styles. Um because they didn't define a theme. They didn't leverage anything about RuneScape that's iconic and thematic and
Mm-hmm.
run with it. They removed special attacks from the game, right? There was no more Armadillo
Yeah.
Godsword for 2 years or something. Ice Barrage wasn't a thing
And
anymore.
even now, special attacks really feel lackluster to me. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
because their application is very weird.
Right.
Like again, it's a result of them like they just forced it back in without a real high level goal because they were in panic mode. They're like, "Oh my god, wait, people liked Armadillo Godsword. Shit, we should bring it back."
Right.
And then they just brought it back without actually thinking what
Right. How
function
would
does
this
special attack.
apply to the
Yes.
modern game? Right.
What's the theme of special attacks? What is their purpose? Because right now, especially with Essence of Finality, special attacks are just abilities with extra steps, right? Like that's how they're treated. Um,
Right.
and sure, now they're introducing some special attacks with new weapons that fit a little bit closer with like a theme, like the new bow has kind of a theme.
Personally,
But
I don't even like thematically though, like with the things that they're doing now with like the late game stuff. First of all, I agree with your point that there should be some kind of theme from the early game, right? Because how is anybody supposed to know about the late game as a new player, right? But it feels like this whole the themes that they're going for, whether it be like crit or range is supposed to be like more like multiple hits. It feels more like a theme for really late game players to it's less of a theme like thematically, and it's more of just like a theme for combat and like how to
yeah,
maximize it, right?
yeah, it's
It
like the
doesn't
spreadsheet
feel
theme.
right. It doesn't feel like an RPG theme. It feels more
Yes.
of like okay, what is the PV? How is the PVM Discord gonna come up with
Yes.
to min max this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why I hate. Well, that's why when they were going through Elder God Wars, right? They released Fractured Staff of Armadillo, and that's the big magic damage buff. Then they released Crypt Bloom, and I was like, so is magic the DPS theme? Like, is the theme with magic DPS because you gave it a Fractured Staff of
Yeah.
Armadillo, or is it tank because you just gave it the only tank set in the game that's a real tank set?
Right.
And the fact that Crypt Bloom followed Fractured Staff shows me that they don't have a theme outlined for magic. Crit is not a theme. Like it's
No.
I guess a play style, but it's not really a theme.
Right.
And it's also
That's probably what I was
because
going for is play style.
yes,
Yeah.
it's
Uh-huh.
it's not a theme, even though they're like what you said it perfectly, and I mentioned it in my video. Like Tsunami gives you a crit buff, and then that crit buff stacks with Fractured Staff of Armadillo, so you get a ton of adrenaline. So you use Smoke Tendrils, which always crits, then you use Omni Power, and it hits 4 times. Like sure, the gameplay kind of like develops a rotation, but again, there's no theme behind
Just because there's
that set
synergy
ability.
behind the abilities
Yes,
mechanically doesn't mean that it makes sense like
thematically, yeah.
thematically or even intuitively. You know what I
Like,
mean?
why does a tsunami into like a glitchy tendril animation give me insane amounts of adrenaline?
Oh god, Tendrils abilities look terrible. Yeah, they
It
like
looks so
yeah.
bad,
Yeah.
but there's no theme there. And then even the fracture staff of Armadillo, like they can't execute on the theme because the theme is going to look glitchy. Firing an auto attack every time you crit while you use long animations like
Right.
Sunshine, you're kind of like up in the air and you just see random things flying out of
Right.
your
And then
body.
all of a
It's
sudden
like
there's just this random air thing or
all they had to
yeah.
do, like very simply, all they had to do was every time you crit, lightning from Armadillo also strikes the target.
That would
Right?
make
Like
sense. Yeah, yeah, sure.
simple.
Right. That would
Just
make
very
more
simple
sense
ways.
than like an auto attack. Like it could still
Yeah.
function the same way. I mean, not that I think that
Exactly same way.
not
Yeah.
not that I think that
Right.
the FSOA is a good example of like balance or design from that perspective, but it could
No.
function the same way. But again, I agree with that. Like the Armadillo battle staff have some kind of like lightning. It could even look exactly
Tornado,
like
whatever.
Carapax lightning or something, or like
Exactly, right? Like you already have the
yeah.
theme there. Same with what was it? Magma Tempest. They went with these like visuals that I hate, and it's the what I
Yeah, I
call
saw that
vomit
ability.
particles.
I saw that ability, and it doesn't make me feel like it's Tazar or Zuck or something like
Yeah.
that. It doesn't make me
It
feel like
also
that.
first off, it's really loud. Like it's like constantly falling. There's just so much. I call it particle vomit. If you ever see a noxious staff, it just looks like vomits of particles. Like it looks bad.
Mm-hmm.
But then go do the Zuck fight and the mechanic I was talking about earlier, where Hurricane bombs you. That should have just been Magma Tempest. Like it. I need to like show you.
Yeah, you have to show.
An
I've never done Zuck on RS3, so you'd have to like again. My account's
well,
still pretty new.
that's okay.
Yeah, you have to show me what you're talking
I
about.
need like a visual of it. I don't know if they actually have it. But anyways, they already have a visual that would have worked better for Magma Tempest, and they didn't use it.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I found a GIF of it. So I'm gonna send it to you right on Discord if it lets me.
Okay. Let me see.
Nope, it didn't send as a GIF. Wait, I can just send you the link.
Yeah, it's gonna mess up the point of view on the stream here, but that's okay. I'll look at it quick. Let's see.
But if you take a look, see how there's like things falling. It's very clearly on tiles. They could have just used that as Magma Tempest, and just have it linger.
Right, like those kind
but
of like they look like lava
blob.
balls. Yeah,
exactly. Let the drop the lava balls and then just leave them there.
Right,
and then that's sufficient for the ability. But instead, we got this really loud particle-y ability that just doesn't sell me magma. It just looks like falling fire.
Yeah,
not even falling fire. It looks like falling,
I don't think that specifically is an issue, but it like I don't think that specifically, like, I'm not saying that an ability can't look like that, but again, it just doesn't feel like Zuck or Tazar themed. Again, kind of going back with like the iconic RuneScape things, right? Like, everything in like the Inferno, for example, in old school, feels like it could belong in the fight caves. You know what I mean? It's still like the same theme. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's still very much the same theme. Magma Tempest doesn't give me that feel like, this, it doesn't give me the feel like it's volcanic and Tazar and Jad or Zuck themed. It just doesn't feel that way to me anyways.
Yeah, and I honestly got this. We're getting a little bit off topic, but I kind of got the same vibe even from the cape too. I was like,
Yeah, I don't like the look of them.
Cape is animated, the kiln cape is animated, and this one is not.
Oh, like they're not?
Just like,
I didn't look that closely.
No, they're not. The standard Zuck capes aren't. I think the hybrid one has a trail, but I was like, why would you get rid of the animation? That's like
it's
classic,
iconic.
iconic.
Yeah.
Exactly,
right.
It's iconic. And so for little things like that to not be served, I think we miss opportunities for people to remember them as iconic. Because who doesn't know Jad, right?
Right.
Who doesn't know what a fire cape is? But if you show someone like a Zuck cape, no one cares, right? Like it's not iconic enough for anyone to care. It's not memorable. It doesn't etch a memory into your brain. And I think that's what EOC never did.
Yeah.
Like 10 years. How many people are nostalgic about how EOC was 10 years ago, right? Like
who's nostalgic about Drygors?
Exactly. Like it's not, and like what you were doing with Drygors versus what you're doing now. Whereas Dragon Scimitar and Whip are iconic. There's an argument for maybe it's just because we were 12 when those came out, but I don't know. I
disagree with that though. Like
that's fair.
Maybe it's easy to be more impressionable when you're younger. But at the same time, like there's still been enough time for EOC to develop something iconic. There's been plenty enough time, right? Hell, EOC is like, okay, an example, like EOC is about as old as Skyrim, right? Skyrim's incredibly iconic, obviously, right? You hear the shout sounds, or those guard voice lines, right? Like everyone knows what you're talking about, right? So, and even then, right? Yeah, it's the same time period as well, right? So like, we were older when that came out versus when the Dragon Scimitar came out. So I don't think that's really.
That's a good counterpoint.
Yeah, I don't think that's a really good argument, because there's plenty, like I think Skyrim's a perfect example actually, because it's literally the same. It's like 2012, right, or 2000 something like that it came out.
And it appeals to a very similar player base. So if you were 18 when Skyrim came out, even now 18. You hear. Yeah, exactly. Like you hear the dragon shout, and you're just
took
like,
an arrow in the knee.
I know exactly what that is.
Or like there's so many like kind of iconic things about that game.
Yeah, that's my main issue. Is there's nothing for me to like latch onto with EOC. Nothing about any of the combat styles makes me think, wow, that was iconic. There's no ultimates that make me think, wow, like
that's an ultimate. Yeah.
They just don't sell it for me, and they even tried. Like there's an ultimate where you jump up into the sky and slam down, but the sound effect doesn't sell it, and I still will always think Ice Barrage or Armadillo Godsword sounds cooler, and it's also sometimes hard to pinpoint exactly why. And it's not necessarily just the animation or just the visual effects.
Yeah.
But there's again, Armadillo Godsword as an example, it wasn't just a cool animation, it was also a hard to get weapon, and it was a very powerful weapon. Whereas if I'm using the Meteor Strike ultimate, I unlock it at 30 strength or something. And I'm using it the same way with an adamant longsword as I was with.
Oh, is that what that is? Meteor Strike? You're jumping in the. It looks so. It looks so weird.
Like
yeah, like
there's something like that.
I guess I didn't even think about it, because it's just like it kind of happens so fast. You know what I mean? It doesn't even. I didn't even think about like jumping in the air and slamming down when I use that. You know what I mean? It just kind of.
I might be mixing.
I think it is Meteor Strike, right? Like it's an AOE ability, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You jump up and you slam down. Yeah. So you just. I don't know. It just didn't hit a theme for me, because the ultimate abilities are so disjoint from the rest of what you're doing that you kind of can't even keep up with it.
Yeah.
Right? Like when I use Omni Power, it has no relation whatsoever to the other abilities that I was using. But that's the only ultimate I have up until 66 Magic, where I can transform into a ugly model and do slightly more damage.
Right, which has nothing to do with the elements,
Yeah,
that's another good example.
Into an elf person or whatever.
Yeah, I liked your proposal for like how to change Omni Power. Go check out the video if you guys haven't already. But like Metamorphosis is another one that could be really cool, right? Like based on like it could be, right? Like think about it with the elemental theme that you're talking about, right? Like say you're using an air spell and then you transform into more of like an air elemental or whatever the hell however they want to write it.
Yes.
But then that gives you different abilities, or that affects your abilities in some way, right? Or have using water spells, and then you use Metamorphosis, and then all of a sudden, that makes a really basic example that makes Tsunami more powerful, right? Which would make sense in that context, right? Like that's a really oversimplified example, maybe. You know what I mean? Or you gave me better examples in your thing. I think about like fire. I think you could give more like explosive damage if you used the. Anyways, you guys go check out the video to see that. But something like that feels like a missed opportunity. Yeah.
It is a missed opportunity, and it's what EOC should have done. I think it's what people thought it was going to do. But like I said, you take it further. Metamorphosis. Personally, I don't like the idea of like totally taking over the player model. I think giving you some sort of like effect on the hands, like whooshy air if you're air special, whatever, or like your weapon turns into some sort of like air-esque weapon would be kind of cool.
That'd be
something
cool,
like that.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, take it a step further. Maybe Tsunami is an ultimate that's only accessible while Metamorphosis is active. And you know that you want to use it right when Metamorphosis ends, and it's not actually Tsunami, it's some sort of generic spell that transforms based on what your element is, so that if you're using water, it becomes an area of effect, Tsunami effect. If you're on air, it becomes something that maybe lifts everyone up into the air and then slams them on the ground. Like,
Yeah.
There's so much missed opportunity to do cool shit, especially because EOC wasn't restricted. They literally ripped up the thematics of the game and didn't replace it with anything interesting.
Right. Yeah.
What I just described wouldn't have been a shock. Like, people wouldn't have looked at that when EOC dropped and been like, "That's not RuneScape," because EOC already wasn't RuneScape. So it's just like,
Right.
what were they going for?
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like if EOC was cooler, it would have had less of a turnoff from a lot of people. I mean, at the end of the day, there still would have been people who didn't like it. I mean, there's old school players who don't think that we should have added God Wars into the game, right? Like into old school, right?
And that's fine.
That's fine. There's people who are always going to feel that way, but that there's people who think that 2002 was the best version of RuneScape, but at the end of the day, like I think that if it was made cooler and more intuitive, it just better. I mean, I could use a lot of words here, right? But just better overall, that it would have turned a lot less people off, right? Like imagine if there was some super cool animations, right, that came out with those abilities and made you really feel powerful when you're using them, right? I'm sure a lot less people would have been disgusted by EOC. They might not have liked it at first, right? But I think a lot less people would have been disgusted by it,
I think if it was good, I don't think people were against the idea of reworking combat and modernizing it.
I don't even remember.
I think they were just
honestly.
They weren't. I don't think think about it. We have a combat system and it feels like we're limiting our game, and so let's elevate it and modernize it and give the players more interesting tools to create more interesting bosses, but they didn't do that. Like, even the example of the Switchscape episode, we have a boss that came out in 2020 that can be ported to old school's combat system with very minimal changes. Like,
yeah, I didn't think about it that way, but when you put it that way, I was like, holy shit, yeah, it really is. And that's what made me feel like I was like, oh my god, this is just literally an overcomplication of the same game. That's kind of what it feels like.
Exactly. It didn't elevate combat, I think, the way that they were selling that it would. And to this day, I am a full believer. Like, I was interested in the idea of reworking combat. They just didn't do it right. But I'm a full believer of, if EOC was good, player count would have gone up. Because what you wanted a reaction for players to be was, when you log in with this new combat system, they think this is familiar. Like I was mentioning earlier, it feels familiar, but better, but modern, right? Like, how many people are pining for season 1 of League of Legends 10 years ago? No one, because the current game is objectively better than what it was 10 years ago. There's people that have rose-tinted glasses nostalgia towards it.
Sure.
But all those people, if you play it for 5 minutes, you're going to go, okay, wait, this is crap. I'm going to go play the modern version. Because the modern version is what you know and love, but elevated. You can achieve that, right? Old school RuneScape is a result of EOC being so goddamn terrible and so off the mark of what original RuneScape's identity was, that they could release this 7-year rollback and it was like unique enough from what EOC offered that it could get popular, and now it's the more popular game consistently.
Yeah, by a long shot. Actually, this is a really good question from Roscoe. Question for Marty: How could you make it feel familiar yet also make the massive like modern changes that you want? Which, again, maybe that's a little bit of a big question. You know what I mean? I know you didn't write up your whole proposal last night like I told you to, but what are some ways that you could keep this nostalgia, keep these iconic things into a modern system? And I think before you do that, I think that, like, for example, the old school team has done a pretty good job of, within their constraints that they have, of innovating a bit, right? Like, obviously they're quite constrained by that system, right? So if you could take that a step further, well, obviously, you have your whole project combat proposal, but as far as, just, how would you keep that nostalgia, or not this nostalgia, but the iconic pieces of RuneScape, what makes RuneScape, and implement that into your combat system?
Yeah, and I'll answer the question that came first, which is the whole not really a question, but a comment. The whole PK community wouldn't have cared because you would have, in any case, killed.
Right. Sidebar before we get into that, but
right.
Yeah.
So, PKing is a good example. Look at the state of PvP in old school right now. It's very solved, and it's hard to get into because the solving of it is this like really hyper weird optimization of inputs that are frustrating to learn and experience. So players are not particularly enticed to start PKing in old school because the combat system isn't designed intentionally to allow that to happen and to create more meaningfully interesting moments. Because old school PKing kind of devolves into RNG when two very skilled players are going at it.
Yeah.
Because ultimately you can switch weapons in the same tick that you attack. So as much as people want to like pretend like they can predict their opponent, the only way to not become predictable is for you to become sufficiently random, such that it is random if on this tick I am going to hit you with melee or range. Because
But
you're
even
good enough
then,
to know that I'm going to be
in
random.
PvP and old school, there's usually an optimal thing to do.
Yes.
You know, and then if both opponents can 6-way switch perfectly, then like you're right. Then it's just RNG.
Well, that's just it, right? It becomes so optimal that like if I'm on the receiving end and I know it is optimal for you to go for a melee spec on me, I know that that's your optimal move. I know this is your opportunity to spec me out, so I'm gonna pray melee because I know your other two moves are not optimal. So even if I put protect melee on and you decide to range me, sure, you gotta have more DPS, but it was a suboptimal move. Like there's not much depth there because it's so solved. There's nowhere to go with it.
Do you play chess?
I don't, not like actively.
Okay.
I've played it, like I know of it.
Right. Okay. Well, I was asking because like chess is kind of a similar thing with at least very high level players because the game is like 2,000 years old, right? So like amongst grandmasters and stuff, the game is like solved basically, right? Like for the most part. Like if you watch like a really, really high level tournament, like the World Championships, a lot of times it's like 8 or 10 draws in a row, right? Until one person makes a mistake and then there's somebody wins. You know what I mean? And I think that it's like we said earlier, I think the old school PvP system was the best PvP experience you could have on the internet in 2005, right? Or 2006, you know, unless you were bougie and had that attachment for your Xbox and you could play Halo 3 online. You know what I mean? But now I think that people are trying to force it because they want to have that feeling again, but there's just not a lot of people are interested. I think just because there's better PvP experiences in the online, you know, whether it be League or Overwatch or a lot of PvP games that are better. You know what I mean? More in depth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to answer the actual question of how do you make it feel
right. Yeah.
Massive changes. There's no easy answer in that. I can't just sit here and like say I would just do this and it's all solved. You have to iterate, right? That's why you have prototypes and betas. That's why you trial things. You want to elicit that response. So you try things thinking this might elicit that response. Like let's say we make auto attacks. Like there's ideas around being thrown around of like your basic abilities shouldn't be basic, like they shouldn't exist. Just give someone like 1 or 2 auto attacks to play with, and that's your basic ability that kind of fires off automatically. Some people don't like that idea, but the real way to approach that and whether or not it would work or not is to conceptualize the design, trial it with some people that you know. I'm an old school player. You invite them in and you say, hey, old school player, try this. What do you think? Get some feedback to see what people's like gut reaction is to it. How do they feel about it?
Yeah.
And then it tells you if you're on the right track towards something that could work or it can't work. And that's why so many games don't make it out of development hell, because there's an idea that they're running with and then they realize that this isn't going anywhere, so they kill it. You have to iterate and attempt different things until you kind of find what works. But you do that by identifying what makes old school so appealing to people. What do they like about it? What's iconic about it? And then take some systems that you can introduce that create more depth, like a mobility system. Can we introduce a mobility system in a way that resonates with old school players so they don't feel like it's this totally alien thing? Is it even possible? Maybe the answer is no. I don't know. But limiting yourself to RuneScape's themes when you're designing anything, I think, is a good step to appeal to people that already are invested in RuneScape. Like if you come up with a way to implement Ice Barrage more naturally into a whole theme or play style, you have more opportunity to attract those people, because they're gonna go, oh my god, this is the Ice Barrage I know and love, but I can do a few more cool things with it. And it's not totally out there that it feels like it's this very different thing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It's kind of a non-answer, but
yeah, it's kind of a non-answer, but it's not exactly a simple thing to answer either, right? You're right, because it's like a lot of these thematic things, a lot of these iconic things from old school are based on that system. So how do you completely rewrite that in a way that still feels like it's the same?
I would also identify what those themes are in RuneScape first. Like let's say I take old school, and the idea that floats around in my head that it's not a real idea, it's like just me kind of spitballing. I would, if I suppose I wanted to introduce abilities to the game, I was like, we're going to introduce abilities, it's going to happen because there's opportunities for us to do cool things with abilities.
Sure.
Even abilities aren't that far removed from what old school offers, because old school has special attacks, and special attacks are basically abilities.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd agree with that.
and a lot of it comes with how you kind of phrase things. Like literally even something as simple as renaming adrenaline to like special energy or something that resonates a little bit more with old school is enough to like pique people's interests.
Sure.
But what I would do is if I look at old school, crossbows and bows are meaningfully different. Like they're you use them for different things. They do different they have different effects in different use cases.
Yep.
If I was to translate that into abilities, I would give crossbows a very specific set of abilities that is totally distinct from what bows can do. So that if I'm equipping a crossbow, I'm doing crossbowy things. I have access to maybe two basic abilities, like two threshold abilities, and maybe like one or two ultimates at the most. And if I was to be using a bow, I'd have access to a totally different set of abilities.
Yeah, I agree
Maybe
with
you have
that. Yeah.
yeah, maybe you have one set of abilities that's like shared across the combat style that is very generic.
But it shouldn't be 95% of them.
It should be like literally 10% of them.
Right.
And then what I would also do is, if you think about old school RuneScape, it's basically auto attacks until you do a special attack. I would lean into that a little bit more, but think about RuneScape's missed opportunity of attack styles. Like, if you're
Yeah.
wielding a bow, you can be rapid or accurate or long range. What if you lean into that a little bit more so that your auto attack has three possible options? Rapid, where your attack speed is dramatically increased, like dramatically increased.
Right.
Or you have piercing, which means that your arrows come out slower but they apply a bleed or something. And you have long range, which means that you shoot an arrow into a sky and it comes down in a more delayed way, so you delay your damage. Like, and then you build abilities around those basic attacks, quote unquote, that interact with them in interesting ways, so that
Sure.
maybe certain abilities can do cool things if you're on the rapid style, and maybe one of them requires you to stack bleeds first so that you can get the most value out of it. Like, you create a combat gameplay loop that resonates a little bit more with what's classic RuneScape, but a modernized take on it, rather than what EOC did, which is let's take everything about RuneScape and just start over.
Yeah, I think
does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I think that maybe that's a little bit of the league player coming out in you again. But I think that like maybe an auto attack based system like that, maybe you don't, I don't know, maybe I should stop saying that, but like an auto, like, like a MOBA, I think it's just a good example. But like there's lots of auto attacks.
Because old school's all auto attacks, right?
It is, but the thing is, you have your abilities. But I think the difference, I was just thinking about while you were saying that, I think that abilities in a game like League or like Overwatch, they feel more meaningful, right? Where I feel like basic abilities in RuneScape, basic abilities just feel like it's just your trash damage, right? And they don't feel like you're doing anything, right? And that's something that feels like it's just an unnecessary complexity. That's like something you'd say in your videos, is like an unnecessary complexity, is that you need to learn, okay, what's the optimal rotation of these basic abilities, right? And then just repeat that over and over again. When that seems kind of unnecessary, maybe that could just be replaced with a basic attack. You know what I mean? So that your decisions were more meaningful. I'm not saying, I guess, scrap basic abilities entirely, but just having the abilities feel more meaningful. Like in a game like League or like Overwatch, where you really have to think through, like, when are you going to use this ability, right? Because, it's powerful, it has a longer cooldown, etc. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So, someone asked if the suggestion of switching between accurate, rapid, and long range, wouldn't this lean towards Switchscape? And I think I raised the point in my previous episode that switching isn't the problem. Like, it's about having a meaningful input. And you can design the auto attack such that it's not necessarily efficient to go accurate, then rapid, then accurate, then rapid. Maybe you want to be rapid for a few seconds, switch to accurate for maybe 5 to 10 seconds because you want to stack up a bleed, then you go back to rapid. That kind of a switching is fine, because the issue isn't high APM. If those high APM inputs are feeling meaningful, like, it's okay to have switches when you feel like those switches are meaningful. Right? Like when I play Lost Ark, you're putting an input in every like half a second. and that's okay because, like you said, because basics feel more meaningless in RuneScape. Even something as simple as a basic ability having like a direction that you have to pick gives it more meaning, and it makes it feel less daunting. There's a champion that Riot just released, Zeri, and they made her basic attack her ability. So normally you basic attack or auto attack by right clicking, your character just does automatically. This character, if you want to auto attack, you have to press Q, but you pick a direction. So you're pressing Q literally every half second. You're auto attacking input by input. But because people are picking a direction for their auto attack, and because the auto attack can be blocked, unlike standard auto attacks, people are okay with it. It's fine to press Q over and over and over and over again
Right.
if those Q inputs feel a little bit more meaningful.
Yeah, Roscoe here says it's like spell swapping to juggle stacks, but I think that if it was designed properly, it wouldn't be like that, right? I think that if it was designed properly, it should be a meaningful decision that say, like you said, like, you know, maybe every 5 to 10 seconds, but not, well, maybe not every 5 to 10 seconds, but let's say you swap to one for 5 seconds and then swap back, or you know, based on a mechanic the boss is throwing at you, one might be more optimal than the other, right? But again, I think you can do that in a way that also doesn't necessarily increase unnecessary APM, right? Just making it again more complex and unnecessarily, right? Nick says spell swapping feels so bad in RS, right? And that's because of, I think, a bad design choice with that, right? It should feel more meaningful to say, okay, I need Incite Fear now, right? Maybe the next phase of the boss I need to use however the hell you say that one, right? But not swapping every 15 seconds, like on repeat, so you can keep both stacks up, you know?
Yeah, what I just described assumes the user interface adequately supports those kinds of inputs, right? Like the idea of those Incite Fear and Xsang, like stacking them together, is thematically and like from a gameplay perspective, in my opinion, good, but the UI doesn't let you do it conveniently. So it feels like a chore to keep them stacked because switching spells is an annoying experience. If it was easier to do so, people will be more willing to do it. And that feels a little bit more meaningful than randomly switching your weapon, because not randomly switching your weapon, but like switching your weapon to use it with another ability in the same tick, because you know that's just optimal. It's just an optimal part of your rotation.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, everything I just said assumes that we're going to also supplement it with a better combat user interface. Because the idea of like switching things is not a new concept in video games. It's executed on fine. Why doesn't League have a problem, or why don't League players complain that they have to press Q over and over again when they're playing Zeri?
Yeah.
They love it.
Or even old school RuneScape, right? Old school RuneScape players complain about everything, right? But the idea of switching, I guess sometimes it gets a little bit intense. Like Nilo again is a kind of one that's maybe not the best, but you know, it's a better system because those switches feel meaningful. You know what I mean? I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you also you're typically holding the switch. Like if you switch from melee to magic in the middle of a fight, it's because you need magic very specifically to do magic themed things. Whereas there's not much hybriding that occurs in EOC. I think people do it at like 1 or 2 bosses, maybe.
Yeah, like Solak, I've heard, but that's just more or less so that you have DPS ultimates up all the time, from what I understand, right?
It's more optimizing rather than the boss demands that I have to use something that only Magic has access to. Although now they have Crypt Bloom, so people just use that for everything. But Crypt Bloom is not sufficiently thematic for Magic, because why the hell is Magic the tank class?
Right. Like I think Ulm is maybe another kind of good example of that, right? Where where it's like, okay, you have to use Magic on this hand, right? So either you switch or you have a teammate that's dedicated to doing that. You know what I mean? Where
and I love both of those options.
Where I agree that I like both of those options too. Like I think old school does a good job of like allowing flexibility. You know what I mean? Like it allows you to play different play styles. But yeah, I would agree that the combat styles in RS3 feel very ambiguous, right? Like it just feels like, again, they're the same thing, right? You're just repeating, like, again, like you said, a lot of the abilities even between styles are the same. You know what I mean? It would be nice to see. I think a lot of people dread team bosses in RS3. Maybe that's a discussion for a whole nother time, right? But it would be cool to see a team boss where it's not just like, okay, we need 7 players to do this, or we need X amount of players to do this, but rather, okay, you may need 3 to 5 people because you need a person to do this and a person to do this. And maybe that exists right now in the high level. I don't know. You know what I mean? But I think that would be cool.
They do have bosses that have rules. Like Virago has, you have your bomb tank, you have your base tank, etc.
Yeah.
But a lot of the roles have turned into you're the DPS, but you also deal with mechanic X. You're the DPS, but you also deal with mechanic Y.
Right.
Which is kind of.
Well, I think with Virago, that's partly due to power creep too, though.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, right? The game has power creep so much that's what bosses are now. It's like everyone's just a DPS person, and then sometimes you have to equip a shield to sometimes use resonance, but most of the time just go back to DPSing, because if you phase the boss, you mitigate more damage than you could have ever hoped by using defensive abilities.
Right. Speaking of power creep, I think now would be a good time we can kind of swap over. Do you want to take like a 2 to 5 minute break, probably?
Sure.
We could. We'll take a quick break. And so if you're watching this, the next section, we're going to kind of talk about just general things like power creep, more macro game design. I'm curious to see what you say about like kind of the game design of the MMO or the RPG as a whole, like what issues could be addressed there. And that part will be on my channel. And then this more combat focused discussion will be on your channel. So let's take like a 2 minute break quick and come back to that.
Sounds good.